So this tutorial deals with the causes and consequences of forced migration and internal displacement. We need to develop at least two case studies here, or detailed examples of forced movement. And the push factors include environmental and political reasons. We also need to look at consequences for people and places. So we can develop more than two examples here, and we can develop the impacts on the places of origin and the places that are destinations. So there's lots of information in the site on the two examples I've used. The first one being Nigeria, and the second being the European migration crisis of 2015 and 16. So if we begin with Nigeria, and again, there are very clear environmental and political push factors present in Nigeria. So in terms of environmental pressures, there is land pressure and resource pressure on water and food. So there's land degradation taking place, especially in the northeast region of Nigeria. And this is due to a combination of climate change and population pressure. So, you can develop issues of desertification, food security, water security, and this is forcing people off land and that movement towards the cities. There is also the mini case study of 2012 in Nigeria, where we had major floods across the country, which led to the displacement and temporary displacement of over 7 million people. Political factors are really present as well. So you've got a situation of massive ethnic diversity in Nigeria, and you've got a classic example of a minority ethnic group with power over resources, and this plays out in the Delta region. So you can talk about a kind of a political bias of investment that favors one group over the majority. There's neglect of the periphery in favor of the Delta region. And so this instability creates poverty, inequality across the country, and this can be taken advantage of. So groups like Boko Haram, which are highly present in the Chad Lake or Lake Chad region and the northeast region of Nigeria, massive instability there, terrorism offences against villages and communities, classic case of the abduction of the schoolgirls there, which hit the global news, but ongoing conflict, violence between government military groups and militia groups against Boko Haram. So that drives people off their land, pushes them away, and that's feeding really this massive movement of rural to urban migration, leading to megacity growth like Lagos. And of course, already developed in that case study, the problems of housing, of infrastructure development, poor sanitation, growing inequality across the city. And this feeds into further local political instability across the city. In general, you might think, well, if you've got a politically unstable country, you've got military and projects or military activity in parts of the country, active extremist groups, well, this is going to weaken investor confidence in the country, low levels of FDI. So at that national scale, Nigeria not benefiting from this instability. For the individuals that are displaced, they're ending up in refugee camps, and there's the aid agency responses that need to manage those camps. And I'd just like to sort of reflect on the mindset of a forced migrant. They are dislocated from their place. They do feel that dislocation, and this is a cultural dislocation as well, an identity dislocation. You have to remember that forced migrants always want to return. It just isn't always possible. So the second example that we'll look at is the European migration, the forced migration into Europe, which largely took place in 2015 and 16. This is a far more complicated picture because of the different groups of individuals that were moving into Europe, and it's a complicated picture. I mean, there are environmental causes playing out here. You can talk about poverty across North Africa, across the African region. Again, the same issues that we're seeing in northeast Nigeria in terms of land pressure, water and food insecurity, deep-rooted poverty, which leaves people feeling they have no option but to migrate away. So within this forced migration, you've got that debate about whether the economic migrant fleeing poverty and land pressure issues, is that individual a forced migrant? And do they qualify for refugee status or asylum? That's a difficult, complex issue. So what was playing out politically in 2015 and 16? Well, you've got all sorts of conflicts and conflict hotspots. Of course, the Syria and Iraq conflict, the growth of ISIS in that region. You've got Afghanistan and conflict and instability there. Of course, we just mentioned conflicts in Nigeria. So add into this case today, I've also developed Eritrea, an authoritarian government there which oppresses its people with forced military conscription. So you've got many Eritreans making dangerous journeys out of that area. Civil war in Libya as well, a big issue. So Europe feeling the brunt of the consequences, although lots of countries experiencing an influx of migrants at this time, including Turkey and other North African countries. You've got this also complication of very different policies in Europe, with the Germans encouraging migration, Hungary putting up walls and barriers. So very different political views on migration in Europe at that time. And one thing that was very clear was there seemed to be a real deep lack of support from Europe for these countries and the reasons why these people were choosing to migrate. So consequences, well, mass migration itself, the very dangerous journey which these people were having to take, crossing deserts, crossing oceans, confronted with conflict and really insecure places as they arrive, trafficking, people smuggling, abduction, all sorts of crimes which they're facing, and all sorts of dangers. The political issue of trying to decipher who is a migrant, who is an economic migrant, and who is a genuine asylum seeker, really, really challenging from the European context. And actually, the arguably the neglect of resources from the European end in order, in terms of dealing with the migrant. We saw this with the hundreds of individuals that lost their lives, tragically drowning in the Mediterranean, but also in terms of the camps and the refugee centres which were kind of set up hastily to deal with the influx of people. And this has created tensions across Europe, at that kind of international scale, tensions at the national scale within countries, the growth of xenophobic attitudes amongst the European population. And we've seen this develop into the growth of the far right, which we pick up on, in some of the high level aspects of the core later on. So really interesting social, political, economic consequences that can be developed here.